Hey all, it's Mooch. Welcome to My mAhs episode 18. Today we're going to discuss whether a higher continuous current rating for the batteries we use automatically means that battery is going to perform better than one with a lower current rating. Now, continuous current ratings are often used to judge which might perform better, but it's only very roughly true, and we'll see later why. Now, you also may be thinking, hey, I can use a pulse rating in order to compare those also. Problem is, pulse ratings are utterly and completely useless. And this is pulse or max ratings. Even though we pulse, quote unquote, when we vape, problem is there's no standard for setting a pulse rating. What's the length of the pulse? What's the time between pulses? What's the criteria used to set the rating? Is it voltage sag? Is it temperature? Is it cycle life? How long does a battery last overall? Months, weeks, years? All those things have to be defined, and the same standard used by every battery wrapping company or every battery manufacturer in order to be able to compare one battery to another. So pulse rating just from that is useless. And even worse, these pulse ratings, especially a lot of the China battery rewrappers, they're set in a marketing meeting over lunch. They are not set with any kind of testing. Try requesting the data and the criteria used to set the ratings. You won't get the information. Now, I mentioned that's only very roughly true. Why is the continuous discharge rating or the continuous current rating not good for finding the best performers, automatically and infallibly finding the best performers? Well, a continuous current rating is based on cycle life and safety. Namely, it's a recommended maximum current level to operate the battery at in order to get good cycle life, retain decent safety margin. That's what it's for. It says very little direct relationship to performance. Now, a lower continuous current rating can mean better performance because the battery is operating more efficiently, but that's not why the current rating is set there. It's mostly for these two things. Now, it covers basic efficiency, which is good. A lower current rating for any particular battery. If a Samsung 25R was rated, let's say, at 10 amps instead of 20 amps by the manufacturer, it would operate more efficiently at 10 amps. It may not be the battery you're looking for anymore, but it's not the best way to find the best performing cell. As an example, we'll use the 30 amp LG HB6, the king of the high current batteries, a couple of years ago, and compare it to the 25 amp Sony VTC5A. Now, a lot of people might think, hey, the LG is going to be the better choice, the better performer, over the Sony, but it's not true. The Sony VTC5 will actually run for longer and hit harder at the same time at high current levels than the HB6 does. We can't just use these current ratings. They're not monstrous differences between them, but if you're looking for that last few percent of performance increase, you just can't use a continuous current rating. Now, it does work for some. The 30 amp Samsung 20S 2000 mAh battery will actually run for longer at high current levels than the 25 amp 2500 mAh Sony VTC5A. That one, it does work out, but it doesn't work across the board, and especially it doesn't work across different size batteries. With a lot of multi-sized battery mods coming out that could take 18650, 2650, not 26650, 2650, 2700, 21700, just using adapters, or maybe 2 out of the 3 of those, or 4 of those. Some people are saying, hey, I can use an 18650 or I can use a 21700, which is the best? Well, you can't always assume a higher current rating across different sizes automatically means it's a better choice. So how can we choose the best performer? Well, most important, choose a high enough current rating. That might automatically get you the best performer for the particular batteries you're looking at, but this is your safety we're talking about, and you want it to operate efficiently, you want decent performance, you don't want the battery stressing out. Find a high enough current rating. Then from the current rating up higher, there are 2 things you can look at: the watt-hour specification and the DC internal resistance specification. Now, for any battery uncanny timing every time I do a video. Now, for every battery I've tested in the past year or so, I've measured the watt hour and the internal resistance. Before any batteries I tested before then, it doesn't exist, and you'll have to start looking at discharge graphs or asking around, or maybe I had a shootout where I compare multiple batteries together. You can get it from there. But I'm trying to get more of this data out. I hope to create a table with all the batteries just right there with these two numbers, because they are a great way to quickly sort out which might be the better performer. Now, some of you might be saying, well, why can't we use capacity at least for runtime? Well, the problem is the battery's capacity is only true at a very low current level, usually around half an amp, 0.3 to 0.6 amps, depending on the battery or so. At higher current levels, that completely sags down. You get much actually delivered capacity, or actually delivered runtime. So you really can't look at capacity other than huge, broad strokes of choice. Oh, that's 3,000 mAh. That might last longer than a 1,500 mAh at high current levels. So I would say ignore capacity if you're looking for the best performance. Stick to watt-hour specs and internal resistance. Now, some of you are saying, what the hell is a watt-hour? Well, that's okay. Let's dive into this. Now, we use ampere hours or milliampere hours, where you've got milliamps times hours, namely how many milliamps you can deliver at low current levels for how many hours. A watt hour is just watts times hours. Now the watt is voltage times current, voltage times amps, times hours. This is a watt. So voltage times current times hours, where here you've just got amps times hours, or milliamps times hours. So what's nice about a watt hour is it adds voltage to the equation, which is what we're looking for. We want something that runs at a high voltage that's good for regulated and unregulated. So watt hours gives us this power, essentially, times time, which gives us everything we need. And one way that it comes really handy, and the else you have to watch out is, let's say we've got time going across here and voltage here. What's good about a watt hour, number, and why a higher watt hour number is good is, you might have a battery that comes down and goes like this, and it's 3,000 mAh. And I'll have another battery that does that, runs at a higher voltage, still 3,000 mAh. Except look how much higher this voltage runs at. Now, this is a higher voltage, which means it's delivering more power, which means it hits harder. Actually, there's your difference between here. So this battery up here hits harder. Maybe it runs at the same time. If the voltage, down at this voltage, they both end at the same amount of time. But it hits harder. It's going to deliver more power. And if you look at maybe this is 2.5 volts, a standard voltage for discharge to end when you're measuring things like capacity. But what if we go up to like 3.2 volts? Wow. Look at the difference in running time. Because this is up higher, its voltage drops later. We only get maybe, 400 milliampere hours out of this battery. But out of this one, we can get almost the full 3,000. This is why watt hours are important. We can get much more running time out of a higher watt hour battery. Now, if you're using a regulated mod, let's say you're trying to find the best performing battery for a regulated mod, it's easier. Find the highest watt hour number for the battery that has a high enough current rating for what you're looking for. The regulated mod, the circuitry inside of it will make the best of what it's given, no matter what voltage it's running at, etc. It'll just convert that. But running at a higher voltage, being able to deliver more energy, which is what hours involves, the amount of energy a battery can give. For regulated mod, something that runs, see if I could do it in a way that actually showed you something useful. Let's say you had one like this and one like this. So one runs at a low voltage, but for a long time. Let's make that 10 watt hours. Another one runs at a high voltage, but ends up shorter. That can also be 10 watt hours. But in a regulated mod, that's okay, because it's using all this energy or all this energy. This is the advantage of a regulated mod. To be able to take whatever it can from the battery. It'll convert it. It'll handle it. So it's very easy. Just find the highest watt hour spec if you've got a regulated mod. Now, amazingly, if you've got an unregulated mod or a mech, it's a little bit harder because you can have this or this both at 10 watt hours. It really matters which one you pick for mech, because this one here is running at a much higher voltage level, namely it hits a lot harder. Excuse me. Also, it may be something like 3.2 volts might be up here. You'll get no run time out of it, no vaping time. Now, if 3.2 volts, let's say, is down here, this one will run to here, this one will run to here. You'll get more vaping time out of this one, but at a lower voltage. It won't hit as hard. So you can kind of decide, but you have to look at discharge graphs for that. They both have the same watt-hour rating. Well, this is the problem now. How do we pick between these two batteries? How do we know? You don't want to look at discharge graphs. Believe me, I understand. Well, this is where the other spec comes in handy, the internal resistance of the battery. The lower the internal resistance, namely the easier it is for current to get out of that battery, the less power that's lost inside the battery, the harder the battery hits. So you might have the same watt-hour specification, but this might be 15 milliohms, and I'll use omega for ohms, and this might be 25 milliohms. So I might see both are 10 watt-hour batteries, but if I see one with a lower internal resistance, at least at the start, and that's where the internal resistance, that's what it's applied to, the beginning of the discharge, the one with a lower internal resistance will hit harder. So if we're regulated, you can just look at the watt-hour spec and compare that. Look at your current rating before that. I'm assuming you're doing that. For an unregulated or a mechanical mod, you can get the watt-hour spec, but then pick the one with the lowest internal resistance. Now, you can actually just look at internal resistance. Most of the time, all the other stuff's going to be taken care of because you just want the hardest hitter. This one will hit up here at the start, this one will hit here. Now, unfortunately, you can't say, oh, lowest internal resistance battery for mech will always be the best performer all the way through the discharge, because some batteries might start off high, but do this, where another one might start off lower, but then not drop as far for the rest of the discharge. This one here, see it drops down lower? As you heat it up, even just a little bit, a few degrees, its voltage can rise back up again. And so for this part of the discharge, whatever this battery is the better performer, hits harder. For this part of the discharge, now the other battery is the better performer. But we're starting to get into a lot of details that I think most people don't want to dive into, and typically that kind of crossover where one battery is good at the start but another one's better later on only happens at very high current levels and further down the discharge. So I'm thinking for mechs, if the watt-hour specs overall, which take into account the shape of the curves that I was drawing, if the watt-hour specs are close, take the one with the lower internal resistance. If the watt-hour specs, this is unregulated, mechs, are very different, then it's harder, but you can still go with the internal resistance. Also realizing in the back of your mind, hey, I'm choosing the one with lower internal resistance, which means it starts lower. But if this low internal resistance battery also has the much lower watt-hour number, it may not be the better performer throughout the entire discharge. But definitely if the watt-hour numbers are about the same, internal resistance is the way to go for unregulated. As I've spoken before, the capacity does not equal your vaping time. What's great about the watt-hour spec is I do it at like 10, 20, and if I can, because it's within the rating, 30 amps. So you can actually look up the actual delivered energy at different current levels, pick the one that's closest to the way you want to vape with that battery, and find out how it actually runs at those current levels. Well, the reason why capacity doesn't work and doesn't equal vaping time is because it's only measured at very, very low current levels and doesn't take into account the efficiency of the battery and what happens to it as it warms up or as it's being used at all. Now, I know some of you are sitting there like with foam coming out of your mouth and the eyes rolling back your head going, holy, how am I supposed to remember all this stuff? For that, I have the recommended batteries tables. Go down to the description section, find my link to my blog at ECF, the Electronic Cigarette Forum, and you'll find links to my recommended battery tables. Some great choices there. Not huge differences between any of them. Identify the best performers for each size. There's a table for regulated and a table for mech. But if you're looking to, let's say, tweak, if you're deciding between like the Sony VTC5A and the Samsung 20S, two astounding performers, and you don't know which to pick, for regulated and which you might pick for a mech, something like that, or could you use both, or which ones you use for either one of those scenarios, this is where looking at the watt-hour spec and internal resistance can be handy. So let's quickly recap. Regulated mods, higher watt-hour spec, that's the better one to pick. Unregulated and mechanical mods, if the watt-hour specs are similar, get the lower internal resistance. If the watt-hour specs are pretty different, at least a couple watt-hours different, you can get the harder hitter at the start by going with the lower internal resistance, but the higher watt-hour battery will eventually, quote, catch up and be the harder hitter later. Excuse me. And so it gets a little tougher, but again, you could always maybe dive into the recommended batteries table and just get a couple ideas if you're not quite sure. And that's how you can pick the best performer. Don't go by the continuous current rating. That's safety and cycle life related. If you want the best performer, you're going to have to dive a little bit into the math. If you don't want to use the tables, if you're talking to that last 5%, or if you're in a comp or something like that, you want the ball to the wall, absolute hardest hitter, you're going to have to look at some of these other numbers, but it's really not that hard. And once you do a couple of batteries, you'll find it very easy just to compare when new ones come out and you take a look at my test results, which post the watt-hour spec and the internal resistance. That's all for today. Thank you for watching.